One of the most influential counterpoints to the shareholder view of the firm is that of stakeholder theory, and it's used in both business ethics and strategic management. The theory came to light in Ed Freeman's book, Strategic Management, a stakeholder approach in the mid-80s, and it really reimagined the purpose of the firm. Rather than seeing the firm as a vehicle for maximizing shareholder returns, the business sits at the center of this web of relationships, and these relationships carry both moral weight and strategic significance. Freeman's insight was simple, but it had a big impact. Managers should consider everyone who the firm affects or is affected by. As he wrote, the stakeholder approach is about groups and individuals who can affect the organization and managerial behavior in response to them. This shift in focus changes the corporate purpose from serving a single constituency, the shareholders, to balancing many: employees, customers, suppliers, communities, and even the natural environment. Profit still matters to Freeman, but he sees it as only one outcome amongst several that are linked to these stakeholder concerns. In so doing, Freeman starts this line of thought in the literature that stakeholders aren't just instruments for profit, but they're legitimate in themselves. Managers need to give simultaneous attention to the legitimate interests of all these appropriate stakeholders. Now, just because we have to take these stakeholders into account doesn't mean that stakeholder theory is anti-capitalist. Freeman and those who followed him make it clear that really what we're trying to do here is create value to generate profit within competitive markets, but that the measure of success is more than just shareholder returns alone. It's about creating value for the stakeholders as well. Stakeholder theory draws from several of those philosophical traditions that we've already covered in the course. For instance, it involves Kantian social contract theory and those ideas of justice and fairness from earlier videos. From a deontological perspective, Kant's categorical imperative suggests we need to treat people as an ends in themselves, not merely as a means to an ends. That means stakeholders deserve moral consideration beyond their instrumental value, beyond how they can help us make money. Second, social contract theory. Think of Rawls's veils of ignorance that we went through before. Fair arrangements are those we choose without knowing our position within the web of relationships. Applied to business, firms operate with society's implicit consent. This idea of being embedded in relationships leads to the idea of social license. Firms are operating only via the consent of society, and as a result, some would argue that they owe reciprocal obligations for this right to success and to pay back those who contribute to their success. Finally, fairness and justice. If stakeholders help us create value, some argue that they earn a legitimate claim to being paid fairly for that. Reciprocity, or the idea of a fair return for contributions, lies at the heart of many of the claims of stakeholders. These foundational ideas correct with our moral intuitions about what is fair in business. Treating people with respect, the idea that a firm is embedded within a social dimension, this web of relationships, and the firms depend on more than financial capital. They need human, social, and environmental capital if they're going to generate returns for shareholders, and that this capital, in turn, invokes some form of reciprocal duty. In practice, stakeholder principles appear in many governance structures, engagement processes, and measurement systems. In Australia, we might talk about a social enterprise, and in some jurisdictions like the US, there are even specified corporate forms like B Corps that try to embody these commitments legally as well as strategically. Thus, you can see firms will have stakeholder advisory panels, community consultations, triple bottom line and balanced scorecard reporting, trying to include some of those social and environmental outcomes alongside profit. But does this approach actually work? Well, there is some evidence that these stakeholder approaches can correlate with things like brand loyalty and organizational resilience, although it varies by industry. Consumer brands tend to see a more direct relationship with payoffs like reputation and loyalty. Business to business, harder to show directly. There may be some benefit through trust and supply chain stability, but in fact, the evidence on it is quite mixed. That's because there's these outside forces, regulation, transparency or the visibility of your business, and industry risk. All of these influence when stakeholder management helps performance and when it doesn't. So really it shouldn't be seen as as a panacea that always works all the time. But it does have some appeal in that it links ethics with strategy and it makes moral responsibility part of the competitive advantage. Now, having seen these advantages, we also need to recognize that, like all theories, there are some serious criticism. For instance, one of the founders of modern agency theory, Michael Jensen, argues that the theory lacks a specific objective. Without a single goal like shareholder value, managers are going to struggle to decide between competing stakeholder claims. Which stakeholder should prevail whenever there's a conflict? How do you prioritize these claims when you've got decisions that are going to affect different stakeholders differently? The theory offers no insight into how we should try and resolve these problems. That stands in stark contrast to something like agency theory or Friedman's approach, which provides a clear singular focus for resolving these kinds of problems. Closely allied to this is this idea of accountability that we discussed during week 3. When everyone's owed something, no one can really judge what success is. Who is actually going to hold management to account for these various stakeholder obligations? The only people with direct influence are going to be those in the shareholding group. The other stakeholders generally don't have a say in how the key stakeholders are appointed, how they're rewarded, and how they're disciplined. And that's without even getting into the difficulty of measuring these multiple outcomes with multiple different ideas about what is valuable. Evaluation, it becomes largely subjective. Finally, even the core idea of what a stakeholder is contested. Which firm stakeholders actually should have a claim on the firm? Who are the ones who it should be thinking about? There are some, for instance, Mitchell, Agel and Wood spring to mind, who suggest you need to look at the relative power, the legitimacy claim, and the urgency of the impact on the stakeholder when we make this decision. But even with these criteria, it largely involves managerial judgment and discretion as to whose interest they're going to take into account. At its heart, most of these problems lie in a situation where the interests of the stakeholders don't align with the more traditional markers of success as a firm, particularly profitability and in some cases even their very survival. So how does this theory actually align with our idea of what ethics is? Well, you'll remember that Kant reminds us that we need to respect people, not just use them to achieve our ends, which of course would justify a stakeholder approach. But it also raises a question. What do we do when we have conflicting duties that make real-world decisions complex? How do we treat people with respect when it's going to advantage one but disadvantage another? Similarly, just because we're taking care of stakeholders doesn't mean we're actually going to maximize utility for the group. These are two different questions. And in fact, you remember Kant is pointing us to ignore the outcome. So the idea that helping all the stakeholders is going to lead to some positive outcome is not necessarily the case and runs counter to the core argument that Kant would actually suggest to us. The libertarian view that's based upon this idea of entitlement really suggests that stakeholder theory is overstepping the moral bounds. It's imposing social duties on firms for people who have no entitlement to the benefit they seek. Rather, that these relationships should be voluntary associations generally held by the people who are entitled to use the resources of the firm. For those who are interested in the area, the theory's been developed a long way. People have tried to work out ways of prioritizing it. So we have some prioritization frameworks. We have integration into the resource-based view of the firm, a key strategic lens with which to view the firm. And with technology, we're starting to see feedback help improve decision-making throughout organizations. People are more and more trying to take on practically what they can from the theory in order to help the firm succeed. And of course, global challenges such as climate change and inequality have really driven this idea forward. Businesses are increasingly seen as partners with government, that they play a major role in implementing these approaches, in contrast to Friedman's idea, which is to separate them out and say that is the role of government. Firms are seen as partners, not participants in the system. In the end, stakeholder theory doesn't offer some kind of magical managerial, and it's really no perfect moral compass. It's a lens. It's a lens that widens our view of business purpose and highlights the interconnectedness and ethical interdependence of firms and society. Managers need to make trade-offs. They need to remain accountable, and they need to ensure financial sustainability. Without that, there is no firm. But stakeholder theory reminds them that single-minded concentration on profit alone is not the whole of the story. So if you think about it, Friedman gave us clarity. Freeman gives us the reality of complexity, and how we work those two together is one of the most important tasks senior managers face. In the next video, we're going to look at one way you might be able to do that through this idea of creating shared value.